Probably about the same.
Yeah, I'm curious what I look like too. We don't have any mirrors in the house, so I just have to go by what other people tell me. I like the review you wrote when you talked about my sci-fi books. It started out by saying, "I have to be honest with you, Rich is weird,"
Yeah.
and he probably wouldn't be offended by that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, no, you're wrong. I'm super offended.
You're super
Oh
offended.
yeah, totally.
Nobody's ever told you that before, right?
Uh, I'm trying to think if there's anybody who I've had a conversation with who didn't say it.
Right.
Um, so tell me about your books.
Okay. I have a trilogy in the works. Two of them are out. This is the first one, called The Long Guest.
Mm-hmm.
One sentence summary. Um, an arrogant idolater falls from the Tower of Babel, wakes up paraplegic, and is rescued by a group of people that he would once have looked down upon.
Hmm. So, okay, give a one sentence paraphrase of either of my books.
Yeah. Hang on.
Is it actually
Um,
possible? You have
yeah.
you have you have to have a coherent plot for that to work, right?
A socially awkward genius discovers horrible unseen spiritual world. That would be the first book.
Hmm.
What was
Did
that?
did you read both of them?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, so we'll
And
put
the second one, you almost have to have read the first one in order to give a one sentence summary. But I guess you would say um, socially awkward genius becomes a force to be reckoned with in horrible unseen spiritual world and has a makeover. No, wait, is the makeover in the first book?
the makeover is the first book. The second book is the
Okay.
one where the weird robot thing is trying to kill them all and they can't figure out why and they have
Yeah.
to
And it's more where Ace kind of he's able to do more, even more in the second book.
yeah,
Um,
he realizes that omnipotence has a lot more options than he realized in the first one, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, I mean when it's a what's the word I want? When it's a romp like your books are. You can't really summarize everything in one sentence, but you wouldn't want to because then it would be spoilers.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to explore philosophical ideas and I didn't want there to be any obstacles, so it's like, well, let's just give the characters omnipotent power and then everything will be a question of what should I do rather than how can I do this, if that makes any
Yeah.
sense. So
Well, I
then,
don't know if you read my review online, but and I don't even know if I mentioned this in my review online, but some of it the way that you do the exposition, like the characters discover kind of the rules, you
mm-hmm.
know, of each new thing that they encounter, and we discover it at the same time they do. That sort of reminded me of I think it's Pierce Anthony. I think he does that quite a bit,
Yeah,
where
I
a lot of the story is just characters figuring things out that are cool,
yeah, I went and
and the reader
reread
figuring it out along with them.
a couple of years after my books were out. I went and read all of Calvin and Hobbes, and I realized that Calvin and Hobbes probably influenced my books a lot. Because, in Calvin and Hobbes, there's the episode where he forgets to pay the gravity bill, and so everything's floating away. And, you know, so the idea that the laws of physics
Well,
might just suddenly change.
I gotta tell you, my favorite was the holy bisector and how useful that thing was, and how Heather figures out the possibilities, like where she remembers that she has the lake inside it, and she can release the lake, and
Yeah,
I mean that was pretty awesome,
and then
and the scene where they find it is hilarious, where they're like, "What do we do with it? We can't just throw it in the garbage," you know?
yeah, I'm sure nothing bad could come from this.
Right? What could go wrong? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Wish more people would ask that.
All right. Well, you'll have to give me
Um,
links to your books. So anybody watching the video, which
oh,
at this point I have an
yeah.
audience of about maybe 100 to 200 people, so it's not like
Oh, really?
yeah, this will be the
That's
second
more than I
video.
expected. I thought it was going to be the four people in your Discord group, one of which
Oh,
is me.
no, nobody, I've never invited anybody to this Discord group. It's just kind of a test channel. So,
Okay, well, anyway, so the two books are The Long Guest,
mm-hmm,
and then the sequel is The Strange Land,
cool.
um, in which the same group that fled Babel basically reaches the land bridge.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then the third one will be coming out next year. It'll be called The Great Snake. And people can find them on Amazon. They can find them on Bookshop.
Okay.
Um,
And I'll put a
they can
link
find
in
them
the.
advertised on my blog,
I'll
but
put
I
a
don't
link.
sell them through my blog.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the description also.
Okay, thanks.
So cool. Um, haven't talked to you in a long, long time. You're looking pretty healthy. Things seem to be going well for you.
Adequately healthy, thank you.
Yeah. Um, everything has changed since I spoke to you last, however many years ago that was. I've got 3 kids now, and we just bought a house in North Idaho, and
Oh, congratulations.
I'm recovering from a major bicycle crash where I broke like 8 different bones.
Oh my.
Yep, I broke one rib that collapsed along and shattered my
Who
shoulder
is?
blade and whatever. And yeah, so of course, in typical Colburn fashion, oh, a week after surgery, I was out trying to use the digging bar and picks and shovels and chainsaws and not doing it very well, of course, but I was trying.
So you're not bedridden,
Well,
as I would be with all those broken bones.
I had to sleep in a chair for about a month, and getting in and out of a car was
Oh my.
nigh impossible. And, I say that I was going out and being active outside, but I was basically kind of moving very, very delicately, trying to use one arm to dig a hole and not accomplishing it very
Mm-hmm.
well. I'm back to about 60% now, so
Well,
after
does
two
your house
months.
have a property that you're trying to improve or something like that?
Yeah, it's 5 acres. And so there's
Oh,
trees
cool.
and
Okay. Mm-hmm.
there's a big ravine and massive rock cliffs, and it's very rugged. 5 acres. Really interesting. Yeah. So yeah, we did a season of racing BMX bikes, me and my son. And so I raced the whole year, and towards the end of the season, um, did the 2 races for the day, and then I was just riding the track afterwards, and the pedal broke off the bike right as I was going up a big double jump. So I sort of flipped over in the air and landed with my
Man.
shoulder. Um, yeah, I couldn't have broken at a worse time as far as, how bad I wrecked. So it's just a really weird freak accident. So, but
Well,
but I'm better now.
I hope that it's not permanently life changing for you.
Well, you want things like that to be permanently life changing, you know? Um, I think about,
Not in the sense that you have chronic pain for the rest of your life. You know,
it's not necessarily a bad thing.
maybe in the sense that you stop biking.
No, I probably wouldn't do that. The verse comes to mind that says, "He who has suffered in his flesh has ceased from sin." And there's there's a very practical connection between suffering and turning from sin, given that most sin is in the lust of the flesh. When you yield to the desires of the flesh rather than through reason making the choice to operate by the word of God in the spirit. So, a conscious decision to understand the will of God and act on it in spite of what the desires of my body are doing. So when you do that, um, if you're going to choose to do something that is in opposition to the thing that would make you comfortable, the opposite of being comfortable is suffering. So to deny yourself and take up your cross, for example, in order to do the will of God, that's kind of like synonymous with pain or suffering. So there's not really a way to make a choice that is going to cause me discomfort um, without it being suffering. Maybe I'm not being succinct enough, but there's that connection between denying the flesh and experiencing suffering.
How long have you? How long ago was the bike accident?
2 months.
Have you been in pain that entire time?
I don't hurt right this second, but I mean, yeah, it's pretty much chronic pain.
Are you able to sleep, or does the pain prevent you from sleeping?
Um, I sleep through a lot of the night. It's different every night. There are some nights when it's not so good, but um,
And
yeah,
have you ever lived through a season of chronic pain in your life before this accident?
yeah. I have sales resistance to pain. You know, pain that keeps telling me you should stop doing that, and I tend to say things like, mm, well, I don't know. It's kind of like when you're talking to a spam caller. Somebody's like, hey, we've been trying to reach you about your vehicle's extended warranty. Yeah, I don't really need that right now. Thank you. Pain's like, you should stop doing that. It's like, well, I hear your concerns and I'm aware of them and I'm going to be cautious, but I can't listen to you right now. So
Uh-huh.
it's kind of like this third person. But the struggle with the lust of the flesh, denial of self, Romans 6 through 8, right? Especially Romans chapter
Mm-hmm.
6. It's very much recognizing that the flesh is like a voice that talks to you and tries to compel you to do things. And you have another voice, which is the Spirit. And the Spirit of God, I mean, we could get into that, exactly how all that stuff works, but essentially the will of God, when you know the will of God. Like, oh, here's an opportunity to serve somebody who really needs my help, but my flesh is telling me I'm really, really tired and I just want to walk past that person and do nothing. So I have the wrestle between the will of God and the desires of the flesh. And the flesh becomes like this third party as you think about it. And you become more and more external to your body or the desires of your flesh, the more you are reasoning by the Spirit and operating by the will of God and operating by choice rather than just by compulsion. And you've got that contrast throughout the New Testament in several places where, like in the book of Jude, it describes people like unreasoning animals who are creatures of instinct.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying that people in chronic pain are more spiritual. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know that that's what I'm saying, um, but if it comes off that way, maybe I am saying that. I don't know. I do know that people who have experienced a lot of pain, a lot of trials, a lot of suffering, who can come out of it with a healthy attitude, tend to be a
Oh,
lot
sure.
more patient, a lot more kind, a lot more understanding. And I've met people who have never had any difficulties and have never been through any trials. And I kind of jokingly, but kind of at the same time seriously say, show me a person who's never suffered and I'll show you an asshole. I mean,
Well, yeah, that's true. But also, it's really hard to find a person who's never suffered, actually.
yeah.
Um,
I have found people
uh,
who kind of they grew up spoiled. I had a coworker who his parents paid for college. He got an amazing tech job right out of college. He got this great position, as soon as he got into this company, and he made lots of money, and everything more or less went well for him. And he was a self-righteous, insecure, petty, just
mhm,
kind of a horrible
sure.
person. I
Yeah,
think
because
that,
people figure they take credit for it. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Well,
it
I just
sound,
want to say that as someone who, when I was younger, suffered pretty severe migraines at
mm-hmm,
least once a month, and in retrospect, probably a lot of physical discomfort caused by hormones. I didn't realize I was feeling that, but as I've gotten older and that's calmed down, I've thought, man, I feel great. I feel normal like most of the time. And I realize now that I didn't when I was
yeah,
in my 20s. Um, so, this whole kind of, I don't know, Gnostic or almost kind of Hindu yogi, just ignore your body. It doesn't matter at all. Um, I hear it from
right,
men a lot, like, like it's, just push through it, walk it off, run it off. It's like, okay, but, uh, this is a person who's never had a really severe chronic illness, you can tell.
mm-hmm,
Um, so yeah, I mean, maybe you can. Well, I would say that when I was uh, on my back with a migraine for 2 or 3 days, um, it can be a spiritual experience because you feel desperate.
yeah,
You're calling on God. You're thinking, how am I ever going to be able to do my duties? If this keeps coming back. Um, but in terms of productivity and like being able to take care of your family, I mean, chronic pain can really prevent that. um,
Yeah.
at least in your average woman.
Well,
So
you and I probably
yeah,
have
I don't know.
you and I probably have differing views. Who knows how different on the sovereignty of God, but you and I'm sure, agree on Romans 8:28 that God works all things together for the good of, those who love him and are called according to his purpose, so on. So, if you have chronic
Yeah,
pain in your life and you're responsible to take care of your family, there's always going to be the silver lining. There's always going to be God is aware of this and he is doing something here. And I can find a way to be content. And in a moment of clarity, I might even find a way to be thankful and understand the purpose of this pain and see where it's leading and have a genuine appreciation for it. Which,
sure, it
when
has a
you.
refining effect. I'll give you that. But I mean, if like say you're a young mom and you've
Mhm,
got chronic pain, okay, maybe you're going to grow through it, but it's a pretty raw deal for your kids, you know? Unless you've got somebody helping you much of the time,
mhm,
they're just going to have a crappier childhood experience than other kids are because you're not going to be able to be there for them in the same way. Um, you're not going to be immediately transformed into the image of Christ, so your temper is going to be short. You know, you won't be able to pay attention as much. You just won't be as available.
yeah,
That's just the reality. You know, that's
right.
the
Uh,
limitations of being a human being.
yes.
So
And,
that's why, I mean, I would say, you know,
well,
in terms of
people.
welcoming something like chronic pain, I would say, think about your life situation.
People who know
Uh,
me well,
you know,
or like my doctor, for example, I had just broken, multiple bones, had the collapsed lung, and I walked into the ER and they said, "How's your pain?" I was like, "Well, I can feel it for sure." And I never took any pain meds for any of that. And
mhm.
I don't know, there's a scene in Fight Club that I think influenced me. Did you ever see the movie Fight Club?
No,
Definitely
I know guys
inappropriate
love it,
for
but yeah.
for Christian viewers. Don't recommend it. I can't recommend it. But it has a lot of deep thoughts in it. And there's a moment where they basically pour lye on the guy's hand and it's burning him like an acid burn, except it's really basic. And
Mhm.
he keeps trying to distract himself from the pain. And the guy who's doing it's like, no, this is an important moment. You need to feel it. You need to interact with that pain. And it was actually during my time at Moody, I was really thinking about pain and, you know, why is pain bad? And what would happen if you were to take the theology of God's sovereignty and consider it when you're going through severe pain? And at the time, I was going through a really, really severe back pain. I was crippled. I couldn't move around, whatever. And I thought, if I change my attitude towards this, I may still experience the pain, but at least I won't be snappy and irritable and rude, and I can still have a good attitude. And when I chose to have a thankful attitude towards the pain and I chose to let myself experience it and really like look at it. Like if somebody's yelling at you continuously, which when you're in chronic pain, it's almost like somebody's yelling at you really loud
Mhm.
and they
Yeah.
won't stop. And you're just trying to shut it out and you're trying to distract yourself. And so instead of doing that, I just stopped and listened very carefully to the pain and prayerfully considered God's goodness and what should my attitude towards this thing be? Should I be trying to shut it out or should I listen very carefully to it? And when I chose to be thankful to it, the weirdest thing happened. My back stopped hurting and I was able to function. It was like an instant healing thing. And it's not the only time in my life when I've seen or experienced miraculous healing. But that experience has caused me to, I don't know, think on a deeper level. Definitely think about things like pain and maybe some radical ways. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to go and experiment with sadomasochism or something. I mean,
That's good to hear.
I'm not going to go out seeking pain, but when pain happens, I know that you can do a lot to manage the pain by just being aware of how you're thinking about it. And if you could see me on camera right now, um, I don't look like a person who's experiencing chronic pain, and my attitude is not the attitude of a person who's experiencing chronic pain. I'm aware of it, but it's almost like it's a movie playing over in the background. So,
Mhm.
and I'm not able to manage all kinds of pain or suffering the same way. There are some things like a migraine, for example, that's really difficult for me to deal with. Um, but it's
Okay, so
funny.
you're not arguing that nobody should be affected by pain, and if they are, that proves that they're insufficiently spiritual. That's good to hear.
No, no, but I do think that in as much as you could say that spiritual means having good character, a person who has managed to come through a lot of suffering tends to have better character. So you might say
Oh, yeah.
that people
No,
can
that's
be,
yeah.
yeah, so you can be definitely more spiritually minded if you've gone through a lot of trials, provided you have a healthy attitude and you've been able to process those things. So there's more to being spiritual than just experiencing pain. It's experiencing
No,
pain and
I
putting it
realize that.
in a proper perspective.
Well, it almost sounded like you were flirting with this Gnostic idea that, any concession to your body or acknowledgement that it's part of you or that it affects you at all is bad. And that if you have a really strong mind, you can rise above it, you know, which isn't really a Christian idea. I
Well,
mean,
the
certainly
Gnostics,
the refining of suffering is, but I mean, the idea that, only weak people are affected by their body. That's kind of the dualistic idea that matter is bad and spirit is good,
right, which is
and
the
the body's
Gnostic
not the real you.
yeah, my understanding was the Gnostic idea was that all matter was bad and the spirit was good. Uh,
Right, and it follows from that strong people are the ones that can ignore their body, and that if they have any kind of earthy thing to do, like for example, they're a woman, that makes them spiritually inferior, because they're constantly doing stuff with their body, like bearing children or bleeding, things like that.
oh,
And I
um,
mean, that kind of thinking is really deep in our culture. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places still today. And I think a lot of people think it's Christian, but it's
well,
not really.
denying the body is not necessarily Christian, but doing the will of God in spite of the body is Christian,
Well,
because
sure,
infrequently you'll
but
have the flesh and the spirit are at war with each other. And if you want to submit to the will of God, then a lot of times you're going to have to say no to the desires of the flesh. Um, so that's a real genuine battle. And there's so much of the New Testament that talks about the desires of the body or the desires of the flesh and dying to the
mhm.
flesh. Those who are Christ have
Although I don't think when Paul uses the flesh, he's just talking about the body. He's more talking about the natural man, the sin nature, people's natural instincts, what we want when we're not, when we haven't been renewed.
Yeah, I suppose it could be a deep conversation. I think about the book of James where it says, where do wars and fightings come from amongst you? Don't they come from your desires that are at war in your bodies, you lust and etc. And so
Right. Well, the NIV says your desires at war within you.
sure,
So,
yeah,
that would include your mind and your heart.
yeah, and
Um,
I think there's a connection when you combine the lust of the flesh and the capacity to reason, then you're looking at long-term solutions for having the lusts of your body. So, take somebody who's totally corrupt, say somebody who's a heroin addict, and that is a physical desire that's in the body. You feel,
mhm,
I guess you could say, like a chemical kind of urge to get that fix. And
mhm,
you may think, in order to ensure that I can get that fix in the future, I need to make more money. So you start making concessions to, corrupt decisions at work. You may commit some kind of fraud, or you may be trying to steal from the company. And so greed suddenly it emerges as a fruit of the lust for heroin. And then it could be that there's, a competitor who's trying to get a score where you want to get it. And so then hate emerges as a fruit of that lust for heroin. And you want to kill this person to prevent them from preventing you from getting your fix, and etc. So the, reasoning according to the flesh is also a thing. The mindset on the
yeah, but I mean,
flesh is at enmity with
aren't
God.
spiritual sins such as pride and the desire to be right, the desire for vengeance, anger, those are also considered of the flesh, right?
Yeah, so
And particularly pride, there's not really any physical impetus for that. That's 100% pure uh, heart,
yeah,
100% pure matter of the heart.
I can see a pretty simple connection between pride and the carnal desires. Um, but we haven't even gotten onto the topic that I wanted to talk about. It's interesting. I was going to
Okay,
say
yeah,
we're
sorry. Go
getting
ahead,
off
Matt.
topic,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
well, the discussion's been interesting anyway, and I knew it would be, and I knew there might be. Well, you and I'm already certain, have some theological differences, and I think that's part of what makes the discussion potentially really interesting. And um, I just find any opportunity to have these kinds of conversations such a privilege because there's a chance that I will learn to think about something in a way that I haven't before. And there's a chance that we both might learn something, and maybe both of
I
us in
always know I'm going
some
to learn something when I talk to you, Rich.
maybe both of us can come away better people somehow. Um, I remember when you were telling me about your brother being a Calvinist. That's one of my clear memories when I was living at the
Yeah.
palace, and I didn't know anything about what that meant, and I tried to talk to him about it and try, hear him out a little bit. And I remember he told me this joke. He says, what did the Calvinist say when he fell down the stairs? And,
Yeah.
I'm glad that's over with because the whole
Yeah.
free will thing.
He broke his leg. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I learned a little
I
bit.
told you that joke, or
I,
my brother
I
did.
think your brother did. I don't even remember his
Okay.
name. What's his name?
Nate.
Nate? Is he still
Yeah.
around? Is he still a Calvinist?
Probably.
Oh,
Uh, he's still a believer. He's married, three
yeah.
kids.
Hmm.
Um,
I was
yep.
preaching at the rescue mission in Boise around that time, and I had studied enough of Calvinism to decide that I didn't want to I didn't want to say I was a Calvinist. And
Mm-hmm.
the chaplain there, he was concerned that every time I came and spoke, it was total chaos, and he couldn't rein everybody in because, you know, I still do that apparently, not intentionally, but I
Right. Yeah.
I
Some
want.
people just cause chaos just by being there. They can just walk by a room and chaos breaks out.
Yeah, well, and my
Yeah.
friends all tell me that my primary spiritual gift is the gift of provocation, and
Mm-hmm.
it tends to be true. I there's so many conversations I've had with a pastor or something where I sit down and 10 minutes into the conversation, they're standing up screaming and pointing their finger, and then they walk out in anger, and everybody's going, "What just happened?" And oftentimes it's like I have no idea what I even said, why that person was so angry. Honestly, sometimes I do know, oh, this will be an interesting question to ask. Let's see what happens here. And sure enough, then, the next thing you know, somebody's standing up in the Applebee's screaming insults at me and storms off and makes a big public scene. And I'm kind of going, yeah, I knew that was going to happen.
It sounds like you don't know where the landmines are.
Oh, I know where they are. I just like to cross them. Anyway,
Oh, there's so
this,
many too.
but I don't like beating around the bush. I like talking about things that matter. And I I think because of that, I would say things that people understood what I was saying. There's a lot of motivational speakers who they create sort of like it's almost like they're just making music, and it gives everybody a good feeling. And they walk away and they're like, "Wasn't that an enlightening message? Wasn't that encouraging?" Yeah, what was it about? I don't remember. I have no idea. Well,
Mm-hmm.
when I speak, it's never like that. It's
Yeah, I
always
find that frustrating. Yeah.
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 And so anyway, again, we're getting off topic. But the chaplain he says he wants to pull me aside and he says, "I'm really concerned when you use the word stupid, for example." And I said, "Well, what I was talking about, I thought stupid was a good word for it." But he says, "Well," and then he asked me, "Are you a Calvinist?" I said, "No, I'm not a Calvinist." And he says, "Well, I am a Calvinist, and if you're not a Calvinist, that's fine. That's your choice." And I said, "Well, not according to you, you know." But yeah, that's interesting. Some of the like, what is the logic of a Calvinist arguing with somebody if they're committed to, well, they're like full on no free will of any kind, Like, what are you doing trying to argue with somebody to convert them to Calvinism if they don't have a choice about whether or not they're Calvinist? I don't know.
Okay, I think you're engaging with a straw man there. That might
Yes,
be upheld by some cage stage Calvinists,
yeah, and that's
but I
probably
mean,
the ones that I've encountered because I have encountered the
yeah,
kind that are full on that far to the
yeah.
end of that spectrum. But
Well, often, interestingly, often that's a stage that people hit early. When they
mhm,
first discover the doctrine of election, they get really excited and they start applying it, and they're like, God's super sovereign, everything's determined,
yeah,
and
and I
and
see
then after a
people.
while they calm down and they realize that like Reformed theology is not about creating this watertight deterministic cosmology that
Mhm,
allows us to understand the nature of God and man. It's about finding out what the Bible actually says.
yeah. So
So
you said in okay, maybe I'll put a mark at this point in the video. This is where our conversation officially starts. But one of the
okay.
first things that I wanted to ask you about, you said something about having someone to shepherd you.
Hmm.
And I've come across a lot of reformed people who say that, and I don't understand it. And I'm not saying I think it's dumb and you're wrong or something. I genuinely don't get it, and I can't reconcile it with my current paradigm, I guess. So,
Okay, so
t-
you talked about in your email reading scripture as a whole and as a whole story,
mhm,
understanding it holistically. If you do that, you're going to see that there's never anybody just out on their own living as a complete individual. They're always plugged in to some kind of authority structure. Um, so I don't understand why it's confusing to you. I mean, it is the norm for the people of God to be in groups with people in authority over them. And I'm not saying like authority like they tell you what to wear and when to get up and all that. Um, but even in the New Testament, Christians gathered in groups. They had teachers. They had local shepherds. Paul would write and encourage, like Timothy or Titus, when they were shepherding a
mhm.
local group of Christians. Um, so I don't understand why that's a surprise to you if you're reading the scriptures holistically.
um, I'm trying to sort it out logically. I spent a lot of time talking to, you know, Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Baha'i and sort of these
Uh huh.
obscure groups, and these are some pretty. Some of these are large established organizations, and if you're talking to an LDS person and you want to reason with them from Scripture, well, they appeal to the authority of their group, and you're
Right.
so it's like, what are you trying to do there? Are you trying to bring them under a different authority, or are you trying to get them to be a Berean and do their own
Well, both. I
analysis?
mean, the Bereans are a great example, right?
Okay.
So they were a group of what were they? They were a group of Jews and Gentile God-fearers, right? And they were meeting, like, I don't remember if it was in a synagogue or by the riverside. Okay, somebody shows up and says, "Hey, the Messiah has come." And they say, "Really? How do you know? Let's check the scriptures. Let's check what this guy is saying." And they do.
Mm-hmm.
But then they don't just say, "Okay, kiss off now. We can take it from here. We'll just each take our Bible home." Then they became a church, right? Like Paul planted a church there. Um, I think they had a teacher there. He would visit him again.
Yeah.
So yeah, obviously, as a Christian, when I say a shepherd, I don't mean somebody to tell you what to think. But there's still got to be some kind of authority structure where you're in a group um, of fellow believers. You meet to fellowship together. That's very scriptural.
Yeah.
And
Maybe.
somebody's responsible for the spiritual health of that group and for the doctrine. You
Okay.
know.
Well, give me some clarity then, because fellowship is not the same thing as being under someone's authority. And something you said, they're not telling you how to think. So it's not you. I am an authority over you, therefore you will believe and think this way. Why? What does the word authority mean in this context?
Well, the most obvious example would be church discipline. So somebody in the Corinthian church was sleeping with his stepmother, and Paul said, "Hey, you guys, you can't allow this. You've got to
Okay.
deal with this."
Yeah.
And he also gave them instructions about like the fellowship. Okay, the fellowship was in chaos, right? when you have the Lord's Supper together, you're not waiting for each other. Some people are getting drunk. Other people, it's over before they get there. So yeah, I mean, how to put it here? I guess I haven't thought this out in detail because it seems so obvious. Um,
Well, that's
I
great.
guess I would say these, huh?
That's the point of these conversations, Let's think this
Yeah,
out in
there's at
detail.
least two aspects I would say. I mean, if you're asking me why God established it so that every church is supposed to have a shepherd,
Well, no,
I don't know. I'm sure there's a lot of great reasons,
I'm
but the
still.
two obvious ones are lifestyle. Like if there's a case where you need to do church discipline,
Mhm.
um, and doctrine. Teaching. Um, because you know, Jesus is discipling his disciples, and he knows the scriptures really well, and he knows what he wants to teach them.
Yeah.
And then he opens their minds to the scriptures, and they move on and teach others. And then Paul says the same thing to Timothy, right? What you've learned from me, pass on to men who will understand it and be able to teach it to others. So if you want to have any kind of unified doctrine, which is pretty doggone important, if you don't want the fellowship group to just be kind of like a club, where we all like each other, or something like that, where we're reading together because we actually agree on doctrine, and we're actually searching the scriptures together.
Yeah.
Well, you need
So,
some kind of way to keep that in control. You know what I mean? Uh,
yeah, and well, I don't know. That's the thing. I'm not sure that I do know what you mean. I think about um, the example you gave in Corinthians, which 2 Corinthians 5, it's reported there's sexual
mm-hmm.
immorality amongst you, and such as it's not even named among the Gentiles. Okay, put that person out of your congregation, right? So the church discipline in that sense is enforced by the group, and it is to put them out of the group. It's not, they don't have a head pastor. There's no head pastor role defined in the
Well, we
Bible.
don't know. I mean, we imagine that they did, or maybe they had what many Presbyterian churches have, which is a number of teaching elders, and
It
then
could be.
one or more ruling elders. Uh, yeah, I mean, it's not like I'm not saying every church has to have a one-man show and be some kind of personality cult. That's obviously not healthy, you
Mhm.
know. But and I'm not saying the same person has to be in authority all the time. And I mean, that's a cult, right?
Well,
Um,
there's an
you've got to
interesting
have an
thing
authority structure,
in
or
Corinthians,
otherwise you're not really a church. You're not really a local church. You're
right?
just
And I agree with you. You're not a church in any traditional sense if you don't have a hierarchy. Uh, and it usually consists of a head pastor and then elders and deacons and that kind of stuff. And I've been going every time one of these questions comes to mind, and I really wonder, what does the Bible have to say about this? Well, I go and I read the Bible a few times in a couple of different translations with that question in mind and just see what it says. And that's been a really interesting thing that gets you in trouble a lot of times. Uh, but I've been doing that with the question of church hierarchy and the question of authority. And you come across, um, the word, what is it, ecclesia, which means an overseer.
Mhm.
And an overseer has the role of sort of managing church activity. And church means, the assembly. So people get together, and there are
Yeah,
people who want to help manage the goods and make sure that the widows are really widows
right. That's
indeed, and make sure. And so they're,
deacons are what we call those people now.
oh,
Yeah,
okay.
at least in Protestant churches,
And
those are
there's,
deacons. They're
shepherding. What is the word that's become the word pastor? I can't remember.
That's the word for shepherd in Latin.
In Greek, though, what is it? Is there a word where we get the word pastor? I can't remember. I'll look it up again.
Pastor is a Latin word.
Pastor is, yeah.
Yeah, it's the word for shepherd in Latin.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. And then is there a verse of the Bible that has that word shepherd in it or something? It's different than the ecclesia word, right?
Yeah. You mean like in the New Testament? Where does it say every church has to have, and then there's a Greek word that we're translating as pastor? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, I was trying to find. I if I remember correctly, it's like
Because
you.
I don't think there's a passage like that where it says do this.
Yeah.
Especially because there were so many churches being planted, People are moving around. People are fleeing persecution. You know,
Mm-hmm.
different people are teaching. You get somebody like Paul who becomes a Christian and is obviously super gifted but doesn't know anything yet, and is also kind of a loose cannon like yourself,
Yeah.
And
Well,
uh,
we are.
after many years of study,
Yeah.
they commission him to go plant churches,
So
but that's
we're
not right away.
we're in
But remember,
agreement.
the
Okay.
church in Jerusalem sent him, right?
The church in Jerusalem. What?
He didn't just go out and say, "I'm going to start preaching." They said, "Hey, let's make sure we're all on the same page here. Let's interview him, um, make sure that he's really a Christian." And then when they heard his testimony, they said, "Hey, why don't you go plant a church in where was it, Antioch first?"
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a verse that says everybody must have a shepherd, but if you look at the way they were doing things, that's clearly what was happening. People that knew the Jewish scriptures and had studied and thought about this stuff were teaching with authority, because then when somebody comes along with a bad doctrine, they would be corrected. Like, for example, Peter refusing to eat with the Gentiles. Paul calls him out on it. And then they have the big controversy, about do Gentiles need to be circumcised and can we eat meat? And they actually have to have meetings about this stuff to
Yeah.
hammer out, okay, what's our doctrine? What? And it's not like they're just making it up and saying we have authority. We're just going to declare that Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. They were going to the scriptures and arguing from the scriptures. And then they wrote a letter, right,
Yeah.
to the Gentile churches saying, okay, you don't have to become Jews, but we think it's reasonable if you abstain from meat with blood in it and from sexual immorality, because the law of Moses has not been unknown. It's been preached in every synagogue, for a long time. So
So
again, you have this
who's
idea for in terms of doctrine, you don't have one person, and it's not arbitrary. They're doing it from the scriptures,
yeah? So
but
was
there's
Paul
still an
an
authority
authority over
structure.
Peter, or were they both apostles and they were having a discussion, fellowshipping? I don't see that particular example as an authority issue. It was more of a discussion issue. And
Well, no, the point is that in terms of doctrine, it wasn't enough to just say, "Okay, Peter, you do you." You know, it's like there is a right thing here. There is a right answer,
yeah, and
and we need to make sure that we know it,
yeah,
so that nobody's going out and teaching this stuff. Making the Gentiles get circumcised. So that implies that, yeah, there's part of the function of the authority network, shall we say, um, is keeping doctrine sound.
well,
So that you
Jesus,
don't get heresy spreading throughout the New Testament church.
you've got a lot of examples in the New Testament where the authority structure is Jesus is the head and everybody else is part of the body. And so Jesus said,
Hmm.
call no one on earth your teacher. You have one teacher, me, and you're all brethren. So there wasn't
Right. He said that to
from
the 12.
he did say that to the
Right.
12. And then he
Yeah.
said in the church when there's a dispute, you talk to somebody individually, and then if they
Hmm.
don't listen to you, you bring more, and then if they don't listen to you, you bring the whole congregation together to settle the matter. So this
Hmm.
idea of Jesus as the head and every person being a part of the body, um, that makes perfect sense to me, and that's how the discussion with Paul and Peter is happening. I'm not saying that you should disconnect yourself from people or disconnect from fellowship. I I take every opportunity that I can to engage with people like yourself who are studied and who can hold me accountable and who can challenge my thinking and who can set me straight on something by showing me something that I haven't seen or pointing out a blind spot that I may have. And so
Hmm.
the idea of fellowship and us holding each other accountable and interacting with each other, that is non-negotiable. That you need to do that and you can't survive without it. But I wouldn't call that a hierarchy.
No,
Um,
well, you're saying you're the one that brought up the word hierarchy. I actually didn't, I don't think.
you use the word authority.
Hierarchy kind of implies there's this gigantic pyramid shape, and there's one person like a pope at the top.
Hmm.
And I mean, that's not how Protestant churches work. Um,
Some of them
but
do. You, a lot
well,
of
yeah, it
Protestant
depends on the
churches do that.
denomination.
You have
Yeah.
a lot of the we're here in North Idaho. It's all the Rick Warren model churches where you have the rock star pastor who is beyond.
Well, yeah, and
Yeah.
that's not reformed, shall we say. Um, but where
It's
was I
the
going with
redheaded
that?
stepchild of Protestant churches.
Right, yeah, it's sort of the unholy offspring. Well, I don't want to say unholy,
Oh,
but I
you can
will.
say
The
unholy. I've been to some of these churches. A
the
lot of them.
unholy offspring of Protestant churches and commercial celebrity culture. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a different animal. Um, but no. But my point is that the idea that we all should be able to fellowship together as completely free agents. And I'm not really in authority or under any kind of authority when it comes to my doctrine and my spiritual life. I'll come to your church, but you don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to preach doctrine to me. That's
When,
between me and God and me and my Bible, and I'm
well,
just here for the fellowship. That attitude, uh,
what do you do
I
though?
don't know.
This happens. I was at a church, the church that we first attended when we came to Coeur d'Alene. The pastor's up there preaching, and I didn't
Mhm,
know it at the time, but it's a seeker-sensitive church, and he was reading from, Bill Hybels and from Rick Warren, and he didn't like the
mhm,
term seeker-sensitive, so he says we're a seeker-aware church, and we're trying to become more seeker-aware, and the church was trying to basically everything was about felt needs. Well, what do the people feel like they need? We're going to
mhm.
be that, and etc. And along those lines, he never spoke about sin. He pretty much didn't teach from anything but Proverbs, and every message was, here's how your spiritual life and your relationship with God can ensure that you have more money. And it's like, what are you
Okay.
saying?
So
Anyway,
that's heresy, right?
so
It's
he
basically teaching heresy.
he quotes from 1 Corinthians chapter 6. The guy's
Mhm.
name is Mike Rama, and it's Lake City Church. I'm going to name names because I'm sick of people accusing me of, I know which church you're talking about, so why didn't you just come right and say it? Well, okay, it's Mike Rama, Lake
Mhm.
City Church. He's speaking from 1 Corinthians 6, which the part where it says, do not be deceived, neither adulterers, nor effeminate, nor perjurers, nor kidnappers, or liars, or a list of sins.
Mhm.
It says, none of these people will inherit the kingdom of heaven. So he reads that, and then he stops, and he says, now if you do those things, you're still going to go to heaven. You just miss out on some blessings in this life.
What does this have to do with the question of authority?
It was the church that I was attending, and he was the governing authority of that church. And he was,
Right. Well, if your authority is teaching heresy,
uh-huh.
then you need to leave. I mean,
Okay, so what does that authority really mean then, is the question.
it means you are sitting under their teaching. And while you are a member of that church, they are responsible for you spiritually. They're also responsible to teach sound doctrine, not to teach heresy.
Okay, so
Okay?
then my
And you're
individual,
responsible. Huh?
go ahead.
You're responsible to give them respect. And I mean, that doesn't mean you're responsible to agree with everything they say in a sermon.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, and I mean, many people will indeed go to their pastor if they hear him say something even kind of minor that they think isn't biblical, and give him some feedback. That happens a lot, you know. uh, but it's still like it's like a structure, like a family type structure,
Okay.
where he's responsible for you spiritually. Because if he doesn't, like, if you're like attending, you show up,
Mm-hmm.
you don't think of yourself as a member of the church, you don't think of yourself as under his teaching or his authority in any way, then it's hard for the shepherd to know who he's supposed to be taking care of, you know? Um, in terms of, he can't call you out if he sees sin in your life because you're not really in the church. Is he supposed to go to your house when you
Well,
break your leg and help you out?
but take
I mean,
that one example. If I see sin in the pastor and I'm just a member of the church,
mm-hmm,
it says, amongst you, brethren, you know, whoever is spiritual amongst you, if you see somebody, one of your brethren, in error and you go to him and you turn him from the error of his way, that means that I, as a member of the congregation, can go to the pastor and say, pastor, you're having this affair, and in the Bible it says adulterers won't inherit the kingdom of heaven. You should repent.
right,
You're in danger.
right.
Well, it has
Well,
absolutely
yeah.
nothing to do with the authority structure. So I'm still trying to get
No,
at
it does.
specifically.
Well, I mean, that's a pretty extreme case. If
Well,
the pastor's committing adultery,
it's the
um,
church that I attended for a lot of years. He was having an affair for 8 years, and
why did you attend it for that many years?
I didn't know he was having an affair, and I didn't go that many
Okay,
years.
well, yeah. I mean, well, look, I mean, it's not exactly a parallel, but think about your authority over your children.
Hmm.
You're responsible to teach them. You're responsible to take care of them. Uh, you're responsible to correct them.
Yeah.
Okay. Does that mean you can do whatever you want? Does that mean they can't call you out on it? Does it mean you don't want them to read their Bibles too? I mean, you're thinking of authority, it sounds like in such extreme terms. Like it's this total control.
I'm trying to get a programmer's definition
Um,
of authority. I don't know if you know, but I'm a programmer. That's what I do
that's
all the
the
time.
problem, maybe. It's a human thing. It's among humans. It's not like a binary, zeros and ones kind of thing. It's complex.
Oh, I believe that it's complex. Um, the part of the reason that I'm interested in this question is I had this conversation with the last church that I got kicked out of, and they said you need to come under our doctrinal authority. And I said, I don't understand what that means. Um, and they said, well, you have studied the Bible so much and you know it so well that we're worried that
Hmm.
people might listen to you instead of us. So we want to make sure you're under our doctrinal authority. I said, okay, well,
Were you
this,
teaching something that they didn't think was orthodox? They didn't think was biblical?
yeah, I wasn't
Okay,
teaching
well
it.
that's why.
I mean,
You,
I wasn't actually teaching it, but I
then
believed,
why did they worry that people would listen to you instead of them
I
if
don't
you
know,
weren't teaching
I
it?
was just attending. I wasn't talking to people or anything. I was just attending the church. I have videos online and stuff, but it wasn't like I was going to go in and like start my own sub church. To me, going to church is an opportunity to fellowship with people and whatever. I'm not,
Right.
trying to go in and create a sedition or something.
Well,
Um,
I think I know what you're talking about. When you're a member of a church that you say that you agree on the core things,
mhm.
um, things that are gospel issues, but you have some differences with them. What do you do? Um, Now, I mean, I can't speak for you because it sounds like just because of your the nature of your personality, um, maybe those things kind of turn into time bombs in your case. But I mean, yeah, it's rare that the average Christian is going to find a church that teaches exactly, everything that that person believes. So,
Yeah,
for example, our church in Cincinnati that we attended for a while was for a while it was an independent uh, community church, and then it became an evangelical Presbyterian church. So there were people there that believed in infant baptism, and there were people there that didn't, that strongly believed in believers' baptism.
hmm,
Okay, and the church accommodated both groups. They would baptize your baby because they were an evangelical Presbyterian church. But if you weren't comfortable with that, they would also do a baby dedication.
hmm,
And they'd baptize older people. If somebody said, okay, now I'm a believer and I want to be baptized. Um, so, that's an example of something that I wouldn't leave a church over necessarily.
right.
But I mean, I wouldn't continue attending a church that was kind of, like teaching the prosperity gospel like you described before, or word faith theology. Because that's too much. But rather than saying, well, I mean, it's not rebelling against authority if you say, I don't think this teacher's doctrine is good. You just go
Yeah.
find a different teacher
Well,
who has better doctrine.
it was a weird conversation because like the first thing they brought up, they said, the first sacrifice in the Bible. Do you agree to this definition of the first sacrifice? And they go to Genesis 3:21, and it says, "And God made coats from skin." And I said, well, you got to understand sacrifice is korban, and it just so happens that like
Hmm.
I've practically memorized the whole Hebrew cultures, the 20 different kinds of
Hmm.
sacrifice, and it's like they're telling me you need to accept our definition of sacrifice. Which, why are you even bringing this up? It was the weirdest thing to bring up. And so I said, well,
Hmm.
look, korban, the book of Leviticus opens with, when you come to korban, which means to draw near to God. If it is a korban hatas, which would be the sin offering. If it is a korban asham, which is the trespass offering or the guilt offering. If it's a nedabah, which is like a wave offering or thank offering. If it's the incense
Mm-hmm.
offering, if it's the sweet smelling savor, if it's an olah that is a whole burnt offering, if it, etc.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things, the whole sacrificial system is always somebody wants to draw near to God, so they do so by bringing God a gift. And usually the priest, you know, walks them through the steps of how to korban.
Mm-hmm.
You have to bring this part of the animal. It has to be this kind of animal. Certain feast days, it has to be prepared a certain way. And there's all these different things that the priests are supposed to be the experts on, that they help the people to come. And then a portion of the meat is given to the priest to support them, and a portion of it in some cases is burnt on the altar as God's portion of sort of like a shared meal where it's sent up in smoke because God's up in the sky. And, the word Allah in the Hebrew for burnt
Mm-hmm.
offering literally means to ascend. It's also used to climb
Mm-hmm.
stairs, etc. And so I talk a little bit about this, and I said, okay, now go back to, and God made coats from skin. What gift are the people bringing to God here? How is the priest processing it? Which portion is burned on the altar? I said, if you're going to say God making coats from sin is sacrifice, you might as well say Moses parting the Red Sea is sacrifice, because they have literally nothing in common with each other. There is exactly zero commonalities between God making coats from skin and anything to do with sacrifice. And they said, well, you
Okay.
need to, and then that's where they get into this whole, we are the elders of the church and you need to come under our doctrinal authority. I said, okay, does that mean that I have to agree with you when I know you're wrong? Well, no. I said, well, then what does it mean for me to come under your doctrinal authority? I don't get it. I'm not understanding you, really.
Hmm. Well, not knowing the background or why they brought that particular thing up, I have no idea why that was important to them to find out what you thought about it. It does not seem like a an issue to break fellowship over to me. That's all I can say,
What
But
they,
I don't know the whole story, so yeah.
well, we had a few different conversations that were like that, where they brought up something like John 19, 20, is it John 19? Yeah, John 19, 28 through 30. And Jesus, knowing that all things had been fulfilled, so that the
Mm-hmm.
writings would be fulfilled, he said, I thirst. And they gave him a sponge full of sour wine. He drank it, and he said, all is finished, or it is finished. And in the Greek, it's like Jesus, knowing that all things were tetelestai, so that the writings would be fulfilled, he said, I thirst. Psalm 69:21, and they gave me vinegar to drink, whatever. He took the wine, and then he said, all things are finished. All things are tetelestai. It's the only two places in the whole Bible where the exact Greek form of teleo, tetelestai, occurs. He knew all the writings were tetelestai, except the one, so that they'd be fulfilled. He drank from the sponge, and then they were tetelestai. Um, that passage came up also. Um, and I said, the Greek word teleo, and teleo, it is finished. Teleo is used to refer to finishing speaking, finishing a journey, finishing these sayings, finishing, and it's a word that has a very broad meaning that means to complete or fulfill or to finish or something like that. And it needs context. So when Jesus said, it is finished, right after he said, he knew all things were finished, except for the whole prophecy about the sour wine, drank from the wine and said, it's finished. That passage is talking about finishing the writings. And it just, it's a very obvious linear flow of thought there. If you start back at verse 28. And they said,
Okay.
that's not what it means. Teleo means to pay the sin debt. I said, well, I know that is a popular verse used to, and is associated with the sin debt. But teleo doesn't mean to pay a debt. It means to finish. And in this case, we're
Right.
talking about finishing the prophecies. So if you want to teach that, Jesus pays the sin debt, well, that's a different question. This verse in John doesn't happen to say anything about that issue. And that was a big problem for them. But again, it's like, you need to come under our doctrinal authority was what they kept saying. But do you mean that when I disagree with you, you're automatically right because you're the elders of the church. Is that what you're saying? Because if that's what you're saying, then I'm not going to agree with that either. No, that's not what we're saying. Well, then what are you saying? I don't get it. I really don't get it. So I was trying
Hmm.
to get at
Well,
some understanding of what it meant to be under their authority that like
so
made
when I
some
said a
sense.
shepherd, you immediately thought of that attitude? That was what you were picturing?
No, I honestly don't know. I mean, if a shepherd,
Okay.
there are some
I can't say
people.
that was what I had in mind. I mean, I've never had a church elder or anybody parse theology that finely with me
Hmm,
in terms of we've got to agree on the exact sense in which this word is being used with this passage. I mean, I've sat in, Bible studies where we talked about it. Um,
yeah,
but I've never had it be like a deal breaker. But again, I don't know the background of like, had they watched some online video of yours that made them worried? I have no idea.
right.
Yeah.
Well, and I said some things about atonement theory that they took issue with. So, which you
Were
can
they kind
probably
of,
guess.
this is a little bit of a rabbit trail,
Uh-huh.
but I mean, there are churches that get deeply into, um, I know of a church that got deeply into kind of pietistic, getting into Jewish culture and following the law, the Old Testament law,
Oh,
to the point
the
where they eventually became, they eventually ceased to be a Christian church,
the
basically, and
Hebrew
became
Hebrew roots
a
movement.
neo-Judaic cult. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's called the Hebrew roots movement, and they get really into all of the Jewish laws. But no, they're not that kind of a church. They are a Jesus made sin okay church.
Okay, well,
So
that sounds like it was no big loss then.
yeah, and that's been a difficult thing to come to North Idaho and want to get plugged into a church and to have churches preaching that, oh yeah, adulterers will go to heaven. You just miss out on some blessings here,
Hmm.
and God doesn't
Well,
expect you to turn from sin. He was righteous, so you don't have to be, that kind of thing. It's just like,
yeah, that's heresy.
well, I'm glad to hear you
Um,
say that. I'm sick of hearing.
well, listen, you had some questions about what I mean by reformed. Do you still want to hear about that?
Yes, okay. First of
Um,
all, you said you became reformed. Was one of the things you said in the email.
uh-huh.
And that means that you were something else before. There was a shift,
Right.
there was a transition. So, what is it? And you can personalize this. I want to
Uh-huh.
hear about the journey from I wasn't reformed, and then this happened, and now I am. And what does that mean?
Okay. But I think it might actually be helpful if before I talk about that journey,
Uh huh.
I do tell you what I understand the word reform to mean.
Okay.
Because otherwise it's not going to make much sense. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I realized that I mean you can reform anything, right? So, you know, you can reform your busing system or whatever. And so I think maybe some evangelical Christians, when they hear reformed, they think, what does this mean that I'm in sin, that I need to change something? That's not what it means. Um, it refers to a kind of theological cluster, I guess I would say, a cluster of doctrines um, that came out of the Protestant Reformation post Luther, right?
Okay.
Um, so the writings of Calvin, Zwingli, there were others.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so I would say, and I had some notes and I couldn't find them, but I think the fact that I wrote them down, I'll probably be able to remember it. Okay. So I would say, and I mean, really, it sounds, I don't know, people call it Reformed theology because it was during the Protestant Reformation, but it's just come to refer to kind of this branch of Protestant theology. But I would say it's really not that exotic. I mean, it's really about people studying the Bible and trying to figure out what it says. So I would say the sort of the crown jewel or the most distinctive doctrine is election. That and I'll talk about that in a second, but it has to do with the sovereignty of God.
Okay.
Um, and then covenant theology. We talk a lot about covenant theology in Reformed churches. The idea that, as you know, covenants are a big deal in the Old Testament, and then if you think in covenantal terms, it can help you to understand also what's going on in the New Testament with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then related to covenant theology, usually causes people to be in favor of infant baptism as well.
Hmm.
And then cessationism. Reformed theology believes that the gifts of the Spirit, like prophecy, tongues, and that kind of thing, ceased after the first generation after Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and this is getting into the less central things, but as far as eschatology, they're usually post-millennial or amillennial. So believing that there's not going to be like this big, this rapture, and then there's all these persecutions. It's very dramatic. Just more that the gospel's going to keep spreading steadily over the whole earth,
Mm-hmm.
and
So
then Christ comes back.
on that clarifying question, in
Yeah.
in Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians 15, we shall not all sleep, but there's a mystery, be
Mm-hmm.
caught up to meet him in the air. That's usually what people would call the rapture. Where does that fit in the timeline, or does it?
Okay, well, that could be. We could talk for another hour or two about this.
Okay.
Have you heard of preterism?
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea is that, and I kind of recently discovered this. Like, I had figured out that, is it Matthew 24, where Jesus is warning his hearers about the fall of Jerusalem very clearly, as if they're going to be there,
Yeah.
Like, he's giving them very specific instructions, like, don't go down into your house to get anything,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing.
Yep.
And then he uses all this apocalyptic imagery, like the sun is going to turn to blood and the stars are going to fall and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, but you'll know when it happens. It'll be obvious. But he's obviously talking to the people who are right there, and he's expecting that they will be alive still when this happens, right? So for that passage, it doesn't take many times reading through it. You're like, okay, he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem. He's giving them instructions about how to survive it, which happened in 70 AD. But I recently came across this analysis that I think is pretty convincing, that most of Revelation is also actually about the siege of Jerusalem and kind of the 7 years preceding it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there is some other stuff in there as well.
So
But
you're definitely not in the Calvary Chapel camp of any second now, two will be in the field and one's going to be snatched away and taken to heaven, and the other people are going to be left behind.
No. So that passage you mentioned in Thessalonians,
Uh-huh.
I believe he's answering their questions because they were confused, right? They thought that either Christ was going to come right away, and so nobody who believed in him would die, or just that nobody who believed in him would die. And then some people died, and they were like, "Crap! What is this? What's going on?"
Yeah.
And so he was saying, "No, look, people are going to die. You're going to die. If you die while a Christian, then you'll be with the Lord. And then if you happen to be alive when Christ comes back, then you'll be caught up too. But don't worry about it. Either way, you'll be with the Lord," right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what he's referring to there. But I don't think he knew either. Maybe
See, so
might have thought it was imminent.
you think he's answering they're assuming that being caught up is going to happen, and Paul's not really caring whether or not that happens. He's saying the point is either way you're fine. So he's not necessarily affirming that doctrine. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Tell me the passage. I want to look at it here. Thessalonians what?
I don't remember offhand.
Well, it's a short book. I'll just take a look here.
As concerning our gathering together unto him, do not be soon shaken in mind as if that day had already come. It will not come unless the man of sin is first revealed, who opposes and exalts himself against all that is called God or is worshipped or whatever, so that he himself sits in the temple, blah, blah, blah. But then there's another, I can't remember if I'm conflating two passages.
Okay, here. I'm in 1 Thessalonians 4 here, and starting in verse 13. Okay. This is the NIV.
All right.
Brothers, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, meaning die, or grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. So apparently what had happened is that they were panicking, right? They thought, now that we're Christians, we're not going to die. And then somebody dies. They're like, oh no, what's going to happen to that person?
Yeah.
We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so that we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's own word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left till the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. So it's not like the people who died as Christians are going to have to wait in Sheol like for a really long time. And everybody who's still alive when Christ comes back gets to go to heaven. Apparently that was a worry, right? For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet with the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage each other with these words.
Okay.
Now, brothers, about times and dates we do not need to write to you, for you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come on them suddenly as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape.
Mm-hmm.
But you, brothers, are not in darkness, so that this day should surprise you like a thief. You are all sons of the light and sons of the day. So I understand that, and again, I haven't studied this deeply, but it sounds like, again, he's saying, you're saying, but when? We need to be ready. He's like, look, don't worry. You belong to the Lord. You're living in obedience.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know when it's going to happen, but you'll be ready because you belong to the Lord.
Right. As you know, I know a little bit about world history, and I don't remember that ever happening, so I'm thinking it might still be future.
Oh, well, yeah, that is future, but
Yeah,
a lot of the stuff in Revelation is, if you look at it, there's a commentary coming out, and I'll send you the name of it, because I cannot bring it to mind right now. I'll email it to you. That studies in detail, exegetes Revelation as a description of the events preceding the fall of Jerusalem, and then including the fall of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
I'm
not sure that
when
I
Jesus
would
says
disagree
you will
with
be in the
that
field,
necessarily.
huh?
I said I'm not sure that I could disagree with that because I've had similar thoughts. It's like if I knew the history well enough, I wonder how much of what he's saying here is sort of metaphorical language for something that may have already happened.
Well, it's stinking amazing. Yeah, I'll just take a little side trip. All that imagery that people say, well, look, this is clearly the end of the world because the sky is rolling up and the stars are falling. You can go back to Old Testament prophecies about the fall of a city or of a nation, and you can find the exact same imagery. And that was conventional imagery. Like the stars represented the local authorities,
Yeah.
And often when there was a big battle, yeah, in fact, the sun would turn red because there's all this smoke in the air, and even stuff like a third of the fish in the sea died. Well, apparently that happened in the Sea of Galilee while the Romans were just slaughtering everybody in the countryside. It was choked with blood and with bodies. Yeah, anyway. But I do think you mentioned Jesus saying 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken and another left.
Yeah, which is
I
not
think
the,
that's
not
in
the
that
rapture.
context he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem. And
Yeah.
I think that could be more a case of like you don't know who's going to survive,
Well,
sort of like happened with the Holocaust.
There's something really
Like,
just goofy about people who think that's talking about the rapture. Luke 17 and Matthew 24 are parallel passages. They're both the Olivet Discourse where Jesus talks about
right.
this stuff. And he mixes the coming of the Son of Man in with some stuff that sounds more like the fall of Jerusalem. So it's like difficult to parse. But I suspect that part of what he's talking about is when he comes to gather his elect from the whole world and he comes in the sky and every guy will see it. That language is in there too. So don't be
Yeah,
deceived. It's going to be like lightning. Everybody's going to see it.
right.
Well, that wasn't the fall of
It's like
Jerusalem.
he's looking at it end on, like from where they were standing, the fall of Jerusalem was going to happen. It is sort of blocking, visually blocking the other thing, which is
Yeah.
much later.
But when he says 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken and the other left, he prefaces it. Just like in the days of Noah, they're eating and drinking and marrying, and suddenly the flood came and took them away. 2 are going to be in the field, 1's going to be taken. 2 will be grinding at the mill, 2 will be in bed, 1's going to be taken, just like the flood took them away. The flood didn't rapture them up into heaven. And the disciples in Luke 17:37, it says, then the disciples said, where? And Jesus said, where the corpses are piled and the vultures are circling. Boy, if that's the rapture, and Jerry Jenkins is right, that's a weird rapture.
No, yeah, and I think and he did, and in one of those passages, either Luke 17 or Matthew 24, he also says, some who are standing here will see that happen. You're not going to die. It's going to happen to this generation, right?
Yeah.
And also this thing about him coming. That's another interesting thing that this guy who's got the commentary on Revelation points out. Also in the Old Testament, when God judges a people by sending a foreign army, he describes it as his coming to them, right? He'll say, I'm going to come to you, and that's not a good thing, right? So
Yeah.
Jesus keeps saying, in the New Testament, or in Revelation rather, he keeps saying, "I'm coming soon." You know,
Hmm.
um, and we've people that think it's talking about some future event has to be like, okay, well, soon is 1,000 years is like a day, and so it's only been 2 days, and so it's still soon. But I mean, if you read it as Revelation is actually warning the church about the destruction of Jerusalem. No, it actually was soon. It was just a couple years actually
Hmm.
before that was fulfilled.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna
Um,
have to go back and reread all of that now, and
I'll
maybe.
send you the name of the commentary. I think it might even be out now.
Yeah,
Um,
I've always taken issue with the psychology of the Christians who are like, well, I'm sure glad that, we're going to be raptured out before all this stuff happens. I'm going to be flying up in the sky looking down at all those sinners and, kind of a see you later sucker kind of thing. And I remember
yeah.
even as a kid, I grew up with the tradition of the pre-tribulation rapture
Mhm.
and the Left Behind movie or Thief in the Night movie, in the Left Behind series
Yeah, The Thief in the
mindset.
Night was before that, right? That
Yeah,
was like made in the 70s. Yeah.
there's like the lawnmower and the clothing laying on the ground and,
Yeah, it's
because
creepy. Like the guy's razor is buzzing on the sink and he's gone. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
there's this really weird escapist kind of frame of mind that people have, and there's a Calvary Chapel ish church here, and all of the people, it's like that's all they can talk about, the government, and that's proof that the rapture's about to happen. And then I'm sure glad I'm not going through the tribulation. It's like their Christianity is defined by waiting for this thing
Yeah.
that's based on bad theology that's not going to
Well, and I
happen.
mean, it's not just Christians. Like it's a very human instinct to kind of part of you kind of wishes for the end of the world. Like
Yeah,
the world's going to be flooded in 12 years. The
I've
earth is
met
going to
a
be uninhabitable,
yeah,
and
I've
won't
met
that
a
be
few
great?
Christians who have said, and I said this as a kid, I thought that would kind of be a horrible thing if all of this deception is coming to the world and the Antichrist forgot to just remove all of the Christians right before that happens. And I remember praying and saying, God, if you want me to stay behind to help people, I could stay through
Oh,
that. And
it sounds like Paul saying, I would give up my salvation for the Jews if it was possible.
yeah, aren't I
Yeah.
humble? And aren't you just impressed with my character? But it was, sincerely as a kid, just thinking it seemed kind of
Yeah.
sucky to be like, I'm getting out of here, so much for you
Yeah.
guys. And
Yeah.
but I've heard other Christians say that are like they were taught the pre-trib rapture and they thought that's kind of antichrist sounding.
Yeah.
Jesus talked about loving your enemies and doesn't he want to save people and what? It just didn't make sense.
Well, and the other problem is that, people tend to want to make detailed schemes of predicting it.
Yeah,
And Jesus said nobody knows. I mean, he told us nobody knows. I don't even know. So it's like, if there's a guy in Texas when we lived there that he had like rented a billboard announcing like the date that he thought that the world was going to end. Um,
hmm,
and it's like, dude, Jesus said nobody knows.
yeah. I want to make a big
So
billboard
anyway,
that says
sorry,
like
go ahead.
Jesus is coming back at 3:34 p.m. on Tuesday. Be sure to bring grilled cheese sandwiches. You know.
Or look busy, right? Jesus is coming, look busy, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so to recap, my understand when I say reformed,
Hmm.
I'm talking about the theology, okay? Election, covenant theology, cessationism, and whatever you want to call what we just talked about, postmillennialism or amillennialism or preterism.
Yeah.
Um, so with that as background, um, I grew up kind of like you did, maybe in kind of a vanilla evangelical doctrinal environment.
Hmm.
Um, my dad actually went to Westminster Seminary, which is a Reformed seminary, Presbyterian seminary, but he didn't become Reformed. um, I think because he's not a joiner. Um,
Mm.
and then we ended up in the Mennonite Church, which is Anabaptist. So the Anabaptists also came out of the Protestant Reformation,
Hmm.
but they believe in believers' baptism very much. They were actually persecuted, and some of them were actually executed because they had been infant baptized. And then when they grew up and understood the gospel for the first time, they rebaptized themselves. And this was considered heresy, and they were persecuted for it. So believers' baptism is a really big deal. in the Mennonite Church, which is sort of the opposite of the Reformed denominations like the Presbyterians, that kind of thing. And so in some ways, it has some things in common with the Baptist churches where there's a lot of emphasis on personal choice and individualistic. Like God has no grandchildren. That's a big thing. So that's in a little bit of tension with covenant theology, where children born to Christian parents are in some sense in the covenant, even before they're old enough to understand. That would be. My dad would not be pleased to hear me say those words. uh, so that was the environment I grew up in. But it wasn't like they were saying, "Oh, Reformed theology is bad." I just never heard of it particularly. So when I got to college, I just started to read stuff, and I started to stumble across theological books written by guys who were Reformed, like R.C. Sproul, like Douglas Wilson. And I was like, hey, this makes sense. And the thing about the doctrine of election, which is that, well, no, let me back up a minute. Okay, so as you know, I was also involved in Campus Crusade for Christ.
Yeah.
In college, right? And there's a lot of emphasis on talking to people. You're supposed to present the 4 spiritual laws,
Yeah.
And
Memorized it in
I have
Spanish.
never, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
I have never, I don't think, ever had a conversation with somebody where I walk up to somebody I've never known before, have a conversation with them, and they become a Christian. Like maybe that happens to some people, but not me. But and it's I don't I guess Bill Bright had that gift, but not me. But even if not even in terms of whether they become a Christian on the spot, in terms of how they respond, where they're at and that kind of thing. When you're praying, when you're going to talk to somebody, you very quickly realize that it does not depend on how well you do. I mean, obviously, you want to present good doctrine and you want to be kind and respectful and all that. But I mean, you don't have to do much evangelism before you realize that you could do a brilliant presentation or you could be a brilliant conversationalist, and the person could either totally reject what you're saying or not even be able to understand it. You know what I mean? Not even be able to hear it.
Yeah.
Or if the person's really ready, all it takes is you quote one verse and it's not even a gospel verse, like it's some random verse, like St. Augustine. I think the verse that caused him to become a Christian was something about leaving behind lust, from Titus or something. And that happened to speak to him right where he was at, So, just my experience as growing in Christ, reading the scriptures, reading Reformed stuff, and also realizing just from experience that when somebody is coming to God, the Holy Spirit has to be working on them, And if he's not, it doesn't matter how smart they are,
Yeah.
And if he is, it can be something really, it can be a really poor presentation, and they're still going to come, So, well, that's exactly the doctrine of election. And I mean, part of the doctrine of election is also that nobody chooses God when left to themselves, right?
Okay.
And I mean, that, again, when you hear that, you look at your own heart and you're like, yeah, that's true. I know that I would not want to be saved by grace, left to my own devices, I would prefer to be saved by my intelligence or something like that,
Yeah.
I would prefer to know better than all my teachers. I would prefer to be the free thinker who discovers the thing that nobody else has ever known before, So psychologically, it just makes a ton of sense. So that was how I got interested in Reformed theology. And then, yeah, just the more that I read, including about covenant theology, it just seemed to be based on a thorough, like, a study of the Bible, exegesis of the Bible. In the evangelical circles in which I'd grown up, I wouldn't say they did a terrible job with the Old Testament. But, I mean, the emphasis is always in the New Testament,
Yeah.
That's where you're drawing all your teaching about the plan of salvation and that kind of thing. And often the Old Testament, it was almost like people didn't fully know what to do with it. Whereas Reformed teachers and theologians, they do a great job of that. I mean, they're steeped in the Old Testament. They see redemptive history unfolding in it, through history.
You're moving too fast. I mean, it's like, yeah, this I don't know if a 4-hour interview is really, but when you talk about the doctrine of election, the way that you presented it, it's like I didn't disagree with anything you said, but I know that I disagree with a lot of people who would describe it in a different way. To clarify, when
Hmm.
the Bible is filled with no one comes unless the Father draws him, right?
Hmm.
And um, I have chosen you as an example from Jesus, and
Right.
um,
And
etc.
what was
So
that
the,
passage?
the idea that God has to make the first move, and nobody could come to God without God's help or God making the first move.
Right.
Um,
That's, I would call it the crown jewel.
yeah, that seems kind of like who would argue with that? I mean, I agree that we were lost and he reached out to us. Um, we were like sheep going astray, right? But he's restored us to the shepherd and bishop
Hmm.
of our souls. So we're out here wandering around lost, and God comes down and draws us to him, etc. And yeah, I don't disagree. The idea that it's, maybe it's like you said, there's when people first come into Calvinism, they have this idea that it's like pure determinism. There's also a
Yeah.
ton of stuff in Scripture about our responsibility to respond, and it's like that's on us. Did you believe?
Hmm.
Did you hear? Did you understand? Did you accept it, or did you reject it? Like in Hebrews 4, and maybe you're agreeing with me. I don't know. It says did the
Yeah.
word not go out to them? No, it did go out to them, but it didn't profit them, not being mixed with
Hmm.
faith. Or the passage in Titus where the grace of God appears, teaching everybody, right? It's
Hmm.
teaching. It's like the Romans 1 passage, even his what is it, divine power and authority are manifested from the heavens, the things that are seen,
Hmm.
etc. But then you don't deny that personal responsibility is part of it also then.
Yeah. Okay. So let me back up a minute and in my mind to what you were saying a minute ago, because I think I know how I want to attack this.
Okay.
Um. Okay. Just one caveat. You said I don't think anybody would deny that nobody can come to God unless God is calling them and is drawing them. Um. Some people do.
Okay.
Some really hardcore Arminians, like they got a name like Free Will Baptist Church or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it really affects the way they present the gospel. And I mean, I've sat through services where there's an altar call, and it's all about turning over every corner of your heart to God, you know, and it really inadvertently it puts a lot of pressure on you to it's like you can't really become a Christian or you can't really come to God unless you've done this complete surrender. And you've got to have done this really thorough inventory of your own inner life and turned over every sin and given up every desire, like, right now. Um, and, they make it sound, I mean, it becomes a work, really. Choosing God becomes an act of righteousness in itself. And they would not say that. They would deny it if you asked them. But the way it's presented is that, by humbling yourself, and by doing all this really intense self-examination
Mm-hmm.
and then choosing God and setting it all aside. And the thing is, very few people are ever, well, nobody ever knows their own mind perfectly, right? Or their own heart perfectly. Um, uh, yeah, there's that. And so instead of talking about God, like the work of salvation is the work of Christ, right? Not the work of the person coming to Christ. I mean, not that they don't have to respond, but yeah, I have sat through many a gospel presentation that was clearly given by people that didn't believe in election. And it really affects the way it sounds. It sounds like this huge task or responsibility that you have to do, you know, instead of just follow me.
Yeah.
Um,
A- As I understand it, it's not that complicated. It's very practical, but it is detailed, I guess you could say. So, for example, Second Peter chapter 4, First Peter, I don't know, says,
mhm.
"You've obtained all things pertaining to life and godless or godliness." I almost said godlessness. life and godliness through the knowledge of him who's called you unto glory and honor and virtue, and given to us exceeding precious promises by which we become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world through lust. And I'm meditating on this thought, these promises, and then lust goes away. And it's like, okay, well, let's think of a lust. And I struggled with fear of poverty, like, especially when I was trying to raise a family and not sure where the
Mm-hmm.
money's going to come from. I
Yeah.
find myself tempted to fudge the numbers when I do my taxes because maybe I can pay an
Mm-hmm.
extra bill if I just
Mm-hmm.
don't bother to declare this one thing, or to maybe push for a better position at my job, or maybe take on more extra work than I really have time for. And somehow it's going to work out, but that would mean neglecting my family. And
Mm-hmm.
I find myself wandering into sin, some obvious, some subtle, because of this like lust for the money. And then I'm reminded of seek ye first the kingdom. God
Mm-hmm.
knows that you have these needs before you ask him. Look at the sparrows, the Hebrews passage, let your character be entirely free from the love of money.
Mm-hmm.
For it's written, I will never leave you or forsake you. And I realize that this is an issue of trust. And so here's this lust that's compelling me to sin. And then here's this promise of God that when I realize it, and I can confirm it through God's provision in the past if I just remember the times He's been faithful. So I take these promises seriously, and all of a sudden, all these temptations that are related to sins with money are just
Mm-hmm.
like completely stupid. Why did I? And that process,
Right.
that's a paradigm shift, and it makes me think of Galatians, where it says, you know, having begun in the spirit, are you now made perfect by the works of the flesh? Galatians 3. So one that works miracles amongst you, does he do it
Mm-hmm.
by the works of the flesh or by the hearing of faith? And then Jesus, the same thing in John chapter 6. He says, my words are spirit. You need to labor to believe. Hear what I'm teaching. Believe
Mm-hmm.
it, be changed by it. So the whole process of being transformed by the renewing of your
Mm-hmm.
mind, being set free from sin, character growth, being made righteous, conforming to the likeness of Christ, you know, I see salvation as very much a transformative process that makes you into a person who is Christ-like. It happens by the truth that is revealed, especially in the teachings of Christ, but you know, the whole Bible, and
Mm-hmm.
also the truth that's God brings situations into your life to give you an understanding of this concept. You know, so the whole package is it's a transformative
Right. Well, you're
package.
you're talking about being transformed into the image of Christ,
Yeah.
sanctification.
Okay.
But if you were a really hardcore Arminian,
Mm-hmm.
then every time you fell out of that, you would wonder whether you were really ever a Christian at all. You know,
So you
gee,
believe
maybe
in
I need to.
eternal security then,
Huh?
along with the reformed package?
Yeah. So now I've got two things to address.
Sorry.
Uh, yeah, I'll just say yes for short.
Okay.
Believing in election is brings with it a lot of assurance. Okay. But I realize that both are taught in the Bible, that it is possible to fall away, and also the perseverance of the saints are both taught in the Bible. Um, but yeah, in terms of like, if you have a really choice focused theology, like
Mm-hmm.
it's on you, it's on your personal choice, then my experience has been you're much less secure. You know, because anytime that you discover some new sin in your own character, um, you feel like, well, maybe I wasn't a Christian. You know, because I didn't turn this over to God when I first became a Christian. So do I need to do it again? You know, whereas when you know that Christ's work, Christ's righteous life is yours, you know, it's the great exchange, right? He has called you, you belong to him. Then that process is the process of being saved, but it's not like, you know, you're in the door, you're not out the door. You're not like having to go out and come back in again. I think my dad might have just brought my boys back here,
Oh, do we have to cut it short?
which is a shame. But I'll try to address the other thing. You were asking about determinism. Okay, Calvinism
Mm-hmm.
as determinism. Um,
Right.
and is election the same as So does that mean that there's literally no such thing as choice and literally no such thing as free will and God controls it all, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, that's kind of the caricature of Calvinism, right? That most people react against.
Well,
Um,
to make it really simple, could a person be predestined by God for salvation but end up not saved?
no. But that's kind of a misleading question. So let me just back up a little bit. Um, so we know that the Bible teaches election, right? And it even uses the word predestination, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Paul even goes so far as to say that some people are vessels of wrath, right? Like Pharaoh, God hardens his heart. Um, okay. We also know that the Bible teaches that human choice is a real thing, right? Because it's constantly calling on us to choose, and it's constantly appealing to our conscience and our will and our reason and all that, right?
Yeah.
Um, and we know that beings exist in the universe other than God, right? Satan exists, he makes choices. People exist, they make choices. If you take this sovereignty of God thing all the way to pure determinism, then where you end up is basically nobody exists but God, right? We're all just puppets.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, we know from our experience that we exist and we make choices, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I think if you try to, and so both of these are true, right? They're both taught in the Bible. God is sovereign, and also man is responsible, and man makes choices. Okay, I do not think that it's possible for a human being to make a logically consistent cosmology that includes both of those things. Okay, if you try to work it all the way out and trace it all the way back and make it fit and make it this logical system, you're going to give up one of those things. You're either going to deny that God is sovereign or you're going to deny that human choice exists. Whereas both of those things are clearly true. Okay, so I think what we're getting into here is paradox territory. Like, because we don't understand the nature of God, and in some ways we don't really understand the nature of man or what choice really is. Like, we know what it feels like when we're doing it,
Mm-hmm.
um, but we don't really get it. So the attempt to make those two things work together or to fit together and explain it, I think is futile. But we know that they both appear in Scripture. And as far as our own daily life and our own salvation and that kind of thing, it actually makes a lot of psychological sense. Because even when it doesn't come to salvation, when it comes to other choices, big life choices, decisions that you make, the way your thinking changes, um, most people, their choices are motivated. You know, they're not pure rational beings. We're not computers that just make these choices with almost no inputs from the outside.
Maybe
You
you are
know,
not.
uh,
My
yeah, you
my
might be,
my
but
wife accuses me of that all
but I
the
mean,
time.
most people have a ton of stuff going on, and they're influenced by people that they know, and they're influenced by things that are totally out of their control, like their health that day, the weather, who happens to be there, when they're thinking about it, and even people that think they're very rational and logical, often you can see that their thinking is motivated in ways that they're not aware of. Um, so I think this idea of like pure kind of in the void, abstract free choice, we know from our daily experience that that's not really how our choices work anyway. They're always motivated. We always have an ulterior motive,
Yeah.
good or bad, usually bad. Um, so it's not a surprise to be told, uh, for example, you were dead in your sins. You were unable to choose God, and God made you alive together with Christ. And that's Reformed people talk a lot about that. A common example is like, um, if you walked into a morgue and there's all these bodies lying here, and you had a serum that you could inject them with to bring them back to life, and you said to the bodies in the morgue, "Who wants to come back to life?" None of them would raise their hands. They can't because they're dead, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to inject them with the serum first. And then if you were to say, "Who wants to come back to life?" Yeah, they'd probably all raise their hands. So they're choosing it, but the only reason they're able to choose it is that you gave them that ability by bringing them back to life. That's an illustration, a very common illustration for how salvation works.
Yeah, I think about my kids. Who wants ice cream? Well, maybe they all want ice cream, but unless I provide it, they can't have it. And unless I come and offer it to them, they wouldn't be responding to that choice. And it's not super complicated. Uh, and so you've got God making this revelation of eternal life through the resurrection that is pretty evident. Everybody can kind of see what happened there. Everybody's been talking about it for 2,000 years because it was a pretty big deal. Um, and there are people who see it and they pay attention and they want to understand it and they're transformed by it. And there are people who, for whatever reasons, completely reject it or whatever. People have different responses to
Hmm.
what
Yeah,
God did.
but I mean that's so the Reformed doctrine of total depravity is that everybody would reject it. Everybody would reject it unless the Holy Spirit intervened.
So you
And they
believe
would all
that
have their good reasons for rejecting it.
the regenerator in classic the way that the reformers would describe total depravity, you agree with that then? That God does a supernatural
Yeah,
work in a
total
person.
depravity doesn't mean that that people who are not in a state of grace cannot ever do anything good. Um, but it means that nobody's going to choose God on their own.
Okay.
And I mean, there's again, Paul says, "I know that in myself lives no good thing." When he says, "Sinners of whom I am the chief," I mean, who doesn't read that and go, "Yeah, man, I know how that feels." So, and I mean, I think again, it's not like total depravity is that you expect everybody to be sociopaths, but I do find among Reformed Christians compared to evangelicals, there's a healthy cynicism and maybe less naivete. Like we tend to be more aware, that sin nature is a really strong thing. And even as a Christian, I've heard people say, given the intervening steps, anyone is capable of anything.
So, but pause
Even as a
pause for just
Christian.
a second.
Uh,
Um, there's only, you were by nature the children of wrath, right? There's one
mhm.
mention of something that might give you a, an idea that the Bible teaches a sin nature. That there's just that one verse, as far as I'm aware. Um,
Are you kidding? There is none righteous, no, not one. All have turned away. They have together become corrupt. There is no one who does good. There is no one who seeks God.
so that's in
I mean, there's
Psalms.
so
It's
many passages
but
like that in
but
the Old Testament
okay,
and the
just give
New.
me just a second. So take that one verse. It's a quote from Psalms. It's
Uh
quoted
huh.
in Isaiah 66, and that's quoted again in Romans.
Uh huh.
And David says, "The righteous shine forth like the sun. I am righteous from my mother's womb," and blah blah blah. All this stuff that he says about being righteous. However, the wicked, that I've looked at the nations, and there's none righteous, no, not one.
Mm-hmm.
And then Isaiah quotes it again, and it's hyperbole, and it's in contrast to this whole big description of all these people who are righteous. So it's not.
Yeah, but
So I would say if you're going to
so
take the Romans passage, that's at least that verse is not teaching total depravity because you need to understand it in its context. It doesn't mean
well,
that the
what do you
Bible
mean by
doesn't
total
teach it.
depravity? I mean, the idea that people have a sin nature. Um,
Okay, well,
well, let's just go
again,
back to you talking about reading scripture as a whole story.
okay.
I mean, even if you don't want to take a proof text, just look at the way things go throughout redemption history.
Okay, let me make
Look
it a
at
little
David.
more specific. So in Hebrews, this debate has happened a million times, so it's not like we're going to do something new. But in Hebrews, where it says, Jesus was made like us in every respect, he was in a
Mhm.
couple of different passages. There's like an obscure
Tempted in
one that,
every way, but did not sin. Yeah.
yeah, it behooved him to be made like his brethren in every way, to be tempted in every
Hmm.
point that we are. He was made in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, to condemn sinful flesh. There's another
Hmm.
one that says something really similar. Uh, is there any, is there some component that we have that Jesus didn't have? This sin nature thing, is this like a third? Because Jesus
Hmm.
had flesh, sarx.
Uh
He
huh.
he felt hungry and tired, and he felt the lust in his body, I'm sure, at some point, and he felt all of these things that we feel in our bodies. He felt the pain,
Hmm.
and he had the
Hmm.
ability to look at who was causing the pain and think, I could just punch this guy out and he would stop hurting me. So he
Hmm.
went through all those things, but he continued to be in this relationship with the Father where he knew the Father's will, and he trusted the Father and did the Father's will in spite of it.
Hmm.
And that is possible for us to do, to be in this relationship with the Father.
Yeah. once
where
once we are Christians, yeah, once we have His righteousness imputed to us and made available to us as a source of strength for the Holy Spirit. But no, I mean, the
I
sin
would
nature
say
means that.
more simply, once we know God, or rather are known by Him, if you want to put it that way, and you understand the goodness of God that leads you to repentance, and then you're in a situation where you've learned to trust God because you have some sense of who He is. Jesus knew the Father. There's this intimate relationship there, and probably the deeper your relationship with the Father is, the more this kind of thing can happen. But you know when the Father says to put away lying and to speak the truth, and you're in a situation where you can see how convenient it would be to tell a little white lie to your kids. There is no more ice
Mhm,
cream, rather than
mhm,
arguing with them for the next half hour about why they can't have it. But you know,
mhm.
God has never let me down. He knows what He's talking about. He says to be truthful. So I'm not going to lie to
Okay,
my
you're making it
kids.
sound like it just basically goes through a trust relationship with God and through your rational mind. Um,
Well, what I just
but
described
no,
there
I mean,
certainly does happen, though.
no, it does. But the thing is, that's after you have been renewed. In the sin nature, we are at war with
But
God.
again, sin
Okay,
nature. What is the
so we
sin
are
nature?
unable.
To be carnally
I'm
minded?
telling you, it's a state of being at war with God. It is a heart that is dead. Okay, that is unable to turn to God,
Okay.
and that is unable to choose God or to go through that process that you just described. Okay, so it's possible to see what would be the right thing to do and actually want to do it and not have the power to do it. So what else was I going to say just now? Um,
No.
you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Jesus talks about the new birth. You actually have to be born again. You have to be given a new nature. Once you have that new nature, yeah, that process that you just described is possible for you. But if you don't, you're dead. That's why the Bible talks so much about you died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. You have to die. Uh, you literally need to have your heart of stone taken out of you and be given a heart of flesh. So it's not just like you go through this intellectual process where you see, okay, God is good, I can trust Him, I should obey Him, now I will. You actually need to be renewed spiritually and given a new nature. And yeah, once that happens, then what you just described is going to become natural to you.
That
But
that
it's not natural to people who are dead in their sins and at war with God.
this paradigm shifting thing that happens where truth is revealed. Metanoia, right? You know that Greek word. Jesus
I do,
said,
but I can't remember now what.
"Oh, Jesus said, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Right? Go out and preach the
Mm-hmm.
gospel, saying the kingdom of heaven, and raise the dead, and cleanse the lepers,
Right.
and all that stuff. Metanoia, meta is after, and
Mm-hmm.
noeo refers to like the mind or
Mm-hmm.
reason,
Yeah.
and it's so afterthought kind of is would be like a really literal way, but it's think about what
Mm-hmm.
you're thinking, and then look at what I'm doing, and have a paradigm shift. And then he
Yeah.
starts revealing truth. And I counted, I think, 129 verses that say that Jesus came to reveal, to teach, to
Right.
expose, to
Right.
bring to light. I came to testify of the truth, is what he said. He
Mm-hmm.
was manifested in these last times for you. The eternal life was revealed so that your faith and hope would be in God. So
Right. I
you've got
mean, when it's
this.
happening, it feels like you are seeing the truth and responding to it, and you are. But it's not just happening like through your mind, through your rationality. Because if that was it, then everybody would be a Christian because they'd see that it makes sense, right? That it's rational. Um, I mean, that's why, like I say, they talk about being given a new heart, having to be born again. You
Well,
must be
that
born
the
again.
heart of greed that doesn't understand the promises of God. You've escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust, and lust is this corrupt heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through the promises, you realize the promise, and suddenly the lust goes away. So, this whole process of seeing the truth, understanding it, thinking a different way, and having your desires and your heart transformed by it, that's that's how this works. And you grow in your relationship with God. You grow in righteousness. You grow, and
Mm-hmm.
you could argue that there was like a major turning point where I recognized the goodness of God or the reality of God before I didn't believe He existed, or I didn't know that He loved me, or I didn't understand He loved me so
Right.
much that He would die for me, or something like that. And then this turning to God and saying, okay, I want to enter this relationship. Well, that's a huge paradigm shift. A lot has to happen when this goes on. And so if you've got some sense of what God is like when you decide, okay, I'm going to surrender my life to Him at this moment of salvation or whatever you want to call it, then of course there's going to be all
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things that change. You're going to say, well, that means that I need to stop being rude to people and I need to stop cussing and a lot of stuff happens. But then the
Mm-hmm.
the process of continuing that healing, soteriology, the study of healing, salvation,
Mm-hmm.
that word in the Greek means to heal. The idea of you were going astray like sheep wandering around,
Mm-hmm.
paraptomaton, you've wandered off the path and you're going around. It's translated as sin sometimes. But you're out lost, hating one another, living in lust and living for the desires of this world and whatever. But He's bringing you back in. It's a transformation that happens in this very practical way by understanding the promises of God, the goodness of God, the
Right.
kindness of God
But if you're
in His
asking
way.
about Reformed theology and the
Uh-huh.
doctrine of total depravity, what Reformed theology would say is that you would be unable to do that process, okay,
Mm-hmm.
if you had not been given a new heart.
So
Your old nature killed
it's a
and been given
mystical
a new
thing.
nature.
It's not
Huh?
God coming along and saying, "Look, you're living in lust and greed and anger and stuff like that, and here's where it's going to lead, and here's why you don't need to be that way." And the person either saying, "Oh, I get it," and changing, or "Screw you, God, I don't want any part of that." You're not
Well,
saying that
that's the
that's what
point.
happened.
No, of course that happens too. But the point is that, if you hear that word
Mm-hmm.
and you have not been given a new heart, then you are going to say, screw you, God.
Okay, so the new heart
you
thing,
know,
though,
or you're going to find a bunch of arguments and reasons why it's not really ruining your life and you don't really need to turn from it,
okay,
etc.,
right.
etc.
So
Um,
to make
yeah.
sure I understand, the God giving you the new heart thing is not this practical thing where He's setting you straight with instruction and the truth. It's like a mystical thing. It's like a supernaturally like reaching in and changing your heart so that now He can talk to you. And that event is the election event or
Well, it's happening
prevenient
at the
grace
same
or something.
time, Rich. When Jesus go back, if you just read through John, he talks about this a lot, actually. He says to the Pharisees, "Why is my language not clear to you? Because you are unable to understand what I say. You belong to your father, the devil. He was a liar from the beginning, or he was a murderer from the beginning."
Mm-hmm.
Um, so he's saying that your ability to understand his perfectly clear words um, is hampered by the fact that you've got a heart of stone. You need to be regenerated.
Okay, so that
When you were
regeneration
regenerated, of
thing
course,
though,
what it,
is
huh?
that the regeneration thing though? That's just a mystical, miraculous thing that God just does by His elective choice, or
Right. He does it by his Holy Spirit. You can tell that he's done it because somebody starts to be able to understand what Jesus is saying and respond to it.
yeah. Well, so what it is kind of a we'll never know what it is. We're
The
never
wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it and cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit.
okay. So it's definitely this mystical thing. All right. Well, I'll have to give that some thought. Uh, yeah. I mean, because of the very practical stuff, like I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes.
Mhm.
Right.
Right.
What's the
And
next
everyone who
verse?
believes, why are they believing? Because the Holy Spirit has worked on their hearts.
Okay, but what's the next
Um,
verse?
First to the
It's
Jew and then to the Gentile.
keep going.
What's after that?
Because in it the righteousness of God is revealed. Right.
Right. But I mean, look at his passage in, I think it's Romans 3,
Okay.
where he talks about how, also the entire book of Galatians, um, yeah, the law reveals righteousness and it reveals sin.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have a new heart, that just means you're screwed. You're guiltier than you were before because now you know the law. Okay? So if you haven't been enabled to fulfill it in the righteousness of Christ, then revealing righteousness leaves you in a worse place than you were before, basically. Um, I think the entire book of Galatians is about that. Um, Rich, I'm sorry, but my
Hmm?
battery's low, and I think I have to go take care of my kids, so I'm gonna
Oh,
have
okay.
to end this. But I
That's
would
all right.
love to do this again anytime you want. Okay?
Okay. Maybe we could finish the conversation at some point later. So,
Okay.
yep.
Yeah, I'm sure. It sounds like there's hours more here.
Probably so. And You actually are helping me to understand this point because when you go online and listen to videos, you just get caricatures and straw men, and you kind of come
Often,
away
yeah. Yeah.
hating the other side depending on which video you watched. So it's different when you're
Yeah.
interacting with an actual person and seeing how do they think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, well, I'll put the. You're okay with me posting this video, and I can send you a link to it. And
Yes.
okay,
Please do.
cool. All right, yay! Thanks for taking the time.
All right.
Good to
Okay. It's
good.
good to hear your voice again after 25 years.
Yeah, it's good to catch up with you. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.